I stood in the middle of the busiest airport in the world, staring at a text message that shattered my entire understanding of family. It was the morning of our highly anticipated luxury vacation to the Caribbean, and I had just been told by the ticketing agent that my flight was canceled. Not delayed or rebooked, but deliberately canceled by the person who booked it, my own sister. I looked down at my phone screen, reading her words over and over. "You should be taking care of the kids this week anyway. Do not try to follow us." Right next to that message was a photo of my 6-year-old niece and nephew sitting on top of a mountain of designer luggage in the departure terminal, completely abandoned. While my sister and her husband were sipping expensive champagne at 30,000 feet flying toward a tropical paradise. They had no idea they had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. They thought they were leaving behind a socially awkward computer nerd. They had no clue that the very island they were flying to, the very resort they were planning to take over, was secretly owned by the company I built from the ground up. The fluorescent lights of the Atlanta International Airport buzzed above my head as I rushed toward the international first-class check-in counter. My name is Gabrielle, and at 29 years old, I thought I had finally earned a seat at my family table. I had packed my bags carefully, selecting outfits that would blend in with my sister Jasmine and her husband Connor. Connor was a wealth manager who my parents treated like absolute royalty. I was the golden ticket that elevated our family status, and Jasmine made sure we all knew it. Every holiday dinner, every weekend barbecue revolved around Connor and his supposed high society connections. My parents would hang on his every word, completely ignoring my presence unless they needed someone to clear the plates or pour the drinks. When I handed my passport to the attendant, her perfectly painted smile faltered. She typed furiously on her keyboard before looking up with a look of genuine pity. "I am so sorry, ma'am, but your ticket to St. Bart's was canceled late last night by the primary account holder." I blinked, trying to process the information. The noise of the terminal seemed to fade into a dull roar. People rushed past me, dragging roller bags and clutching travel pillows, but I felt completely frozen in time. Before I could demand an explanation, a sharp cry caught my attention. I turned and recognized the unmistakable sound of my niece, Amara. I abandoned the counter and sprinted toward the seating area near the security gates. There, huddled together on a cold metal bench, were Jamal and Amara. My 6-year-old twin nephew and niece were crying softly, their tiny hands gripping the handles of 3 massive suitcases. They looked terrified. I dropped my bag and pulled them both into a tight embrace, smoothing their hair and promising them everything was going to be all right. "Where is your mother?" I asked, keeping my voice as calm as possible to avoid scaring them further. Jamal wiped his nose with the back of his sleeve. "Mommy and Daddy said we had to wait right here for you. They said we could not go on the big airplane because kids are too loud for Daddy business friends." Rage, hot and sudden, flared in my chest. I pulled out my phone and dialed my mother, Brenda. She and my father, Calvin, had flown out on the same flight with Jasmine and Connor. They were all supposed to be traveling together. The line rang several times before my mother finally answered, her voice layered with the ambient noise of a luxury aircraft cabin. "Mom, what is going on?" I demanded. "I am at the airport and my ticket is canceled." Jasmine left the twins sitting by the security gate all by themselves. I heard a heavy sigh on the other end of the line. "Stop overreacting." "Gabrielle," my mother snapped, her tone immediately dripping with the same condescension I had endured my entire life. "Jasmine and Connor work exhausting corporate jobs. They deal with high-level executives all day, and they deserve a stress-free vacation without children crying in their ears. You just stare at computer screens all day, running that little internet hobby of yours. You have no real responsibilities. Take the kids back to your apartment and watch them for the week." I gripped the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. "Mom, they abandoned 2 6-year-old children in a public airport, and you let them cancel my ticket." My mother lowered her voice clearly, trying not to disturb the wealthy passengers around her. "Connor is meeting very important business partners at the resort this week. He is securing our family future. You know how awkward you get around successful people, Gabrielle. Your social anxiety and your plain clothes would just ruin his image. Do not make this about you for once. Be a good aunt, take the kids home and order some pizza. Have a nice quiet week." She hung up the phone before I could say another word. I stood there listening to the dial tone echoing in my ear. For 29 years, I had let them treat me like the invisible scapegoat. I had let them worship Connor simply because he wore expensive suits and came from a world they desperately wanted to belong to. They thought my cybersecurity and property management firm was just a small freelance gig because I never bragged about my income. I never wore flashy brands or demanded the center of attention. They assumed my quiet nature meant I was weak and unsuccessful. They never bothered to ask how I paid for my apartment or why I was always traveling for client meetings. They simply wrote me off as the weird tech girl who would never measure up to Jasmine. I looked down at Jamal and Amara, who were staring up at me with wide, tearful eyes. "Are we going home, Auntie Gabby?" Amara asked, her voice trembling. I took a deep breath, letting the years of hurt and submission completely wash away. I was done shrinking myself to make my family comfortable. I was done letting them prioritize a fake image over their own blood. I knelt down so I was eye level with the twins, wiping a stray tear from Amara's cheek. "No, sweetie," I said, offering them a warm, genuine smile. "We are not going home, we are going on a vacation." I grabbed the handles of their heavy suitcases and guided the twins away from the commercial ticketing counters. We bypassed the long security lines and the crowded terminals, walking all the way down to the private aviation sector of the airport. The atmosphere here was completely different. Quiet, hushed, and dripping with exclusivity. The floors were polished marble, and the air smelled like expensive cedar instead of stale coffee and jet fuel. I walked straight up to the private concierge desk. The attendant looked up, ready to ask if I was lost. Instead of speaking, I reached into my wallet and pulled out a solid obsidian black corporate card, sliding it across the polished marble counter. The attendant saw the name engraved on the metal Apex Elite Holdings, and her posture instantly straightened into strict professionalism. "Good morning, Madam CEO," she said, her voice filled with absolute respect. "How can we assist you today?" I looked down at my niece and nephew, who were suddenly smiling, then looked back at the concierge. "Get my jet ready," I instructed, my voice colder and more powerful than it had ever been. "We are going to St. Bart's." And just like that, the game changed. I picked up my phone and opened my company security app, navigating to the payment gateway for the resort where my family was heading. I tapped the screen and disabled every single credit profile associated with my sister and her husband. "Let us see how far that white privilege gets you when the money runs out," I whispered to myself. The warm breeze carried the scent of sea salt as we stepped through the glass doors of the Oasis Bay Resort in St. Bart's. The tropical lobby was a masterpiece, but the atmosphere was shattered by an aggressive voice echoing across the floors. I held Jamal and Amara as we approached the reception area. Standing at the front desk was Connor. His face was flushed red, violently tapping his finger on the mahogany counter. Beside him stood my sister Jasmine, crossing her arms in impatient fury. Connor leaned over the counter, attempting to intimidate the calm black concierge. "Do you know who I am?" Connor demanded, his voice dripping with arrogant white privilege. "Run the card again. There is plenty of money in that account, and I am not letting a clerk ruin my vacation." The concierge maintained a neutral expression. "I am sorry, sir," the concierge replied. "The system has declined your $50,000 villa deposit 3 times now. We cannot process the authorization and release the keys until the hold is secured." Jasmine gasped, throwing her hands in the air. "This is ridiculous," she shrieked, turning to my parents, Calvin and Brenda, sitting on a luxury sofa looking anxious. Connor slammed his hand on the counter, demanding to speak to the owner immediately. He threatened to have the staff fired, putting on a massive show for my parents to maintain his facade of endless wealth. I walked across the lobby, the luggage gliding silently. Jasmine was in another outburst when she spotted me. Her jaw dropped in pure shock. She stared at me and her abandoned children as if she had seen a ghost. Then her shock morphed into blinding rage. "What are you doing here?" Jasmine screamed, pointing at my face. She marched toward me with aggressive steps. "Are you stalking us? You followed us to the Caribbean because you are desperate for attention." She turned toward the reception desk and gestured at me. "Security, get over here," she yelled. "Remove this psychotic woman immediately. She is harassing my family." My mother Brenda rushed over, pulling me aside. "Gabrielle, what is wrong with you?" my mother hissed. I told you to take those kids back home. You are humiliating us in front of Connor and these guests. I did not flinch. I calmly pulled my arm out of her grasp and looked at Jasmine. Before I could speak, the concierge stepped out from behind the desk. He ignored Jasmine and her frantic demands for security. Instead, he walked straight up to me, offering a respectful bow. "Welcome back, Madam Chief Executive Officer," he said, projecting across the lobby. "Your private villa is prepared and the staff is ready to assist you and the children during your stay." The silence that fell over the room was absolute. Jasmine froze, her mouth still open from shouting. Connor turned around slowly, his arrogant scowl wiped from his face. My parents stared at the concierge and then back at me as if the world flipped upside down. I kept my posture straight and turned my attention to Connor. "You said you wanted to speak to the owner," I said, my voice cold. "You are looking at her." Connor blinked, rapidly processing the impossibility of the situation. "That makes no sense," he stammered, stepping back. "You run a small tech blog. You do not own a resort in St. Bart's." I stepped closer to him, letting him feel the weight of my presence. "Apex Elite Holdings owns this entire property," I explained. "That is my company, Connor. The company I built while you and Jasmine mocked my career. I did not come here to enjoy my resort. I came to clear up a massive lie you have been feeding my parents." I turned to look at my father, Calvin, who was gripping the sofa. "Connor did not pay for this luxury family vacation," I announced, watching the color drain from my sister's face. "I comped the entire trip through my corporate office. I approved the flights and the villa because I wanted my parents to have a nice holiday. Connor has been lying, claiming he spent his own money to treat the family while coasting on my authorization." My father stood up, his chest heaving as he looked between Connor and me. "Instead, Calvin did exactly what he had done my entire life. He protected the image of his favorite daughter and her husband." He walked over and lowered his voice, trying to manage the situation. "Gabrielle, keep your voice down," my father pleaded, looking nervously around the lobby. "Connor just has a temporary cash flow issue right now. It is perfectly normal in high-level finance. He is meeting investors tomorrow, and he needs to look successful. Do not embarrass him in front of the staff and his friends. Give him the keys to the villa and we can handle this quietly behind closed doors. You have plenty of money, so let him have this win." He was actively begging me to sacrifice my dignity and hand over my property to save the ego of a man who discarded his own children like garbage. I looked at Calvin and gave him a firm shake of my head. "Absolutely not," I replied, my voice ringing with finality. "I am not enabling this delusion for another second. The villa is mine and the kids are staying with me. You can all figure out your own accommodations." Jasmine let out a sob, hiding her face in her hands. Connor, realizing his charm was useless, turned dark and nasty. He sneered at me and reached into his leather wallet. "Fine," he spat, pulling out a sleek metallic credit card. "I do not need your charity anyway. I will buy out the penthouse suite for the week, and we will not have to look at your miserable face." As he slammed the new card onto the desk, my phone vibrated heavily in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw an urgent red notification from my cybersecurity team. I glanced at the screen and then back at the card. Connor was demanding the concierge run. The system alert was crystal clear. The new card Connor had just presented was flagged for identity theft, and the name attached to the stolen profile belonged to my father. The heavy oak doors of Villa Number 1 clicked shut, sealing us inside a sanctuary of polished stone and panoramic ocean views. I guided Jamal and Amara toward the massive sunken living room where a private chef had already arranged a spread of fresh fruit and pastries. The twins dropped their heavy backpacks, their eyes widening at the sight of the indoor waterfall, cascading into a pristine glass pool. For the first time since the airport, their tense little shoulders relaxed. I sat on the edge of the velvet sofa, watching them finally act like normal 6-year-olds, laughing as they picked strawberries from the silver platters. The quiet peace of the villa was a stark contrast to the humiliating circus my family had just orchestrated in the resort lobby. I took a slow breath, letting the cool air conditioning soothe my nerves. But the silence did not last long. The sound of a heavy fist pounding against the front door echoed through the high ceilings. Before my private security detail could intercept, the digital lock chimed and the door swung open. Jasmine barged into the foyer, her face twisted in a mask of ugly entitlement. She had somehow bullied a housekeeping staff member into swiping a master key. Jasmine stormed past the marble entryway, her designer sandals clicking aggressively against the floor. She did not look at me. She marched straight toward the living room and pointed a shaking, manicured finger at the twins. "Grab your bags right now." Jasmine snapped, her voice sharp and frantic. "We are leaving this ridiculous place." Jamal flinched, dropping a strawberry onto the white rug, while Amara immediately hid behind her brother. They did not run toward their mother. They shrank away from her. Jasmine noticed their hesitation, and her eyes narrowed. "Do not look at me like that," Jasmine sneered, softening her tone into a sickly sweet pitch that made my stomach turn. "Mommy is here to save you from Auntie Gabrielle. She tried to kidnap you and take you away from us because she is jealous of our family. Come here right now before she does something crazy." The sheer audacity of her gaslighting sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through my veins. She was actively trying to rewrite reality and brainwash her own children to cover up her absolute failure as a mother. I did not raise my voice. I did not panic. I simply stood up from the velvet sofa and positioned my body directly between Jasmine and the twins, forming an impenetrable physical barrier. "Do not take another step toward them," I warned, keeping my posture rigid and my gaze locked onto her panicked eyes. "You abandoned your children in a commercial airport terminal so you could drink champagne on a flight you did not even pay for. You do not get to walk in here and pretend to be a victim." Jasmine's face flushed a deep, furious red. She lunged forward, trying to sidestep me, but I easily shifted my weight, blocking her path again. "Get out of my way, Gabrielle," she shrieked, her carefully crafted high society persona completely unraveling. "You are nothing but a bitter, lonely woman trying to steal my kids because no man will ever want you. Connor is downstairs right now calling his lawyers. He is going to destroy your little management company and have you arrested for child abduction. Give me my kids so we can go to our new hotel." I stood my ground, refusing to let her toxic energy infect the safe space I had created. "You do not have a new hotel," I replied, my voice dropping to a deadly calm register. "I flagged Connor's stolen credit profile 10 minutes ago. Every luxury property on this island uses my security infrastructure. You are blacklisted from checking into a motel, let alone a five-star resort. You have no money, Jasmine. You have no power here." Jasmine raised her hand as if she was going to strike me across the face. Before she could swing, my phone vibrated intensely in my blazer pocket, delivering a custom alert tone that meant my lead corporate investigator had breached a high-priority target. I did not break eye contact with my sister. I slowly reached into my pocket and pulled out my device, opening the encrypted message screen. The file was labeled Connor Offshore Accounts, and the summary report was already populated on my dashboard. I kept my body firmly planted between Jasmine and the twins as I read the decrypted intelligence report. The truth about the golden white son-in-law my family worshipped was far worse than a few declined credit cards. Connor was not a successful wealth manager working for a prestigious firm. He was an unemployed fraud running a massive Ponzi scheme. The financial documents on my screen mapped out a complex web of shell companies and fake investment portfolios. Connor had been specifically targeting affluent African American church congregations back in Atlanta, using his marriage to Jasmine to gain trust within our community. He had drained the retirement accounts of dozens of hardworking Black families, promising them guaranteed returns, while actually using their life savings to fund his luxury cars, tailored suits, and tropical vacations. I looked up from the screen, staring at Jasmine, who was still panting with rage. "You really have no idea who you married," I stated, feeling a strange mixture of disgust and absolute clarity. "He is not a wealth manager, Jasmine. He is a criminal." Jasmine scoffed, rolling her eyes in disbelief. "You are pathetic," she spat, trying to look over my shoulder at the kids. "You are making up desperate lies because you cannot handle the fact that my husband provides a life you will never achieve. Connor manages millions of dollars for top-tier clients." I looked back down at the decrypted ledger, scrolling past the long list of defrauded church members and shattered retirement accounts. The names blurred together until one specific line of data caught my eye, forcing the breath out of my lungs. I stopped scrolling and zoomed in on the attached collateral documents. The screen displayed a fraudulent second mortgage agreement filed just 3 weeks ago. The property listed was my parents' house. The signature on the loan release belonged to my father, Calvin Hayes, but the digital footprint showed the funds were wired directly into an offshore account controlled entirely by Connor. The golden son-in-law had secretly mortgaged my parents' family home to cover his collapsing Ponzi scheme, leaving them completely bankrupt. The digital ledger on my phone screen felt heavier than a physical brick in my hands. I stood in the center of the living room, watching the color drain completely from my sister's face. Jasmine had spent her entire adult life building a fortress of superiority around her marriage to Connor, but the walls were crumbling right in front of her. Before Jasmine could process the magnitude of the offshore accounts and the fraudulent second mortgage, heavy footsteps echoed in the marble foyer. My parents. Calvin and Brenda rushed into the villa, looking out of breath and frantic. They must have followed Jasmine up from the lobby after the front desk security denied them alternative rooms. My father, Calvin, marched straight toward me, his chest puffed out in that familiar authoritarian stance he used to intimidate me when I was a teenager. Gabrielle, what is the meaning of this? He demanded, his voice booming through the quiet luxury of the villa. Connor is downstairs dealing with a frozen bank account, and Jasmine is up here looking like she has seen a ghost. You need to stop this childish revenge game right now and fix his credit profile before his investors arrive tomorrow. I did not back down. I did not shrink away like the forgotten daughter they always wanted me to be. I stepped forward and held my phone directly in front of my father's face. I am not playing a game, I replied, my voice perfectly steady. Your golden son-in-law is not a wealth manager, Dad. He is a criminal. He is running a massive Ponzi scheme targeting our community back in Atlanta. And worse than that, he just took out a fraudulent second mortgage on your house. He forged your signature and wired the equity into an offshore account. You are bankrupt. I waited for the shock to hit him. I waited for the outrage and the sudden realization that I had just saved him from complete financial ruin. I expected my father to grab the phone to inspect the documents and to immediately call the authorities. Instead, Calvin slapped the phone out of my hand. The heavy device hit the soft velvet rug with a muted thud. You hacked his personal computer! Calvin yelled, his face twisting into a mask of pure rage. You invaded his privacy to steal documents because you are jealous. You have always been jealous of Jasmine and her beautiful family. You are so bitter and single that you would rather destroy your own sister's marriage than admit she found a successful man. I stared at him, completely stunned by his reaction. He was not looking at the evidence. He was actively rejecting it to protect the illusion of Connor. Dad, did you not hear what I just said? I asked, my tone reflecting my absolute disbelief. He stole the equity from your home. The bank is going to foreclose on the house you and Mom worked 30 years to pay off. Calvin shook his head violently, his eyes darting around the room, refusing to meet my gaze. He did not steal anything. Calvin shot back, his voice shaking with a desperate, frantic energy. Connor came to me with a brilliant investment opportunity last month. He told me about a private offshore fund reserved only for his elite white clients. He said, because I was family, he could get me in on the ground floor. He promised a 300% return by the end of the year to secure my retirement. I signed those mortgage papers willingly, Gabrielle. The air in the room grew completely still. The puzzle pieces rapidly fell into place, forming a horrifying picture of my parents' deep-seated internalized racism and desperate need for social validation. They had blindly handed over the deed to their family home to a white man they barely knew, simply because he wore tailored suits and spoke with corporate authority. They wanted so desperately to be associated with his perceived elite wealth that they ignored every red flag. They wanted to walk into our church in Atlanta and brag about their wealthy son-in-law managing their private portfolio. You signed the papers, I repeated, feeling a cold knot form in my stomach. You let him leverage your entire life savings because you wanted to feel close to his privilege. Dad, he is not investing your money. He is using it to pay off the early investors in his Ponzi scheme to keep the illusion going. The money is gone. My mother, Brenda, pushed past Calvin and stepped right into my personal space. Her face was contorted with a toxic mixture of fear and absolute denial. "You listen to me right now, Gabrielle," she hissed, her voice trembling with venom. "Connor is meeting with a billionaire developer on this island tomorrow. He told us this deal would finalize everything and our returns would be deposited by Friday. You are going to delete whatever fake files you fabricated to ruin him. You are going to unlock his credit cards and you are going to let him close this deal. Mom, he is scamming the people at this resort too," I explained, trying to make her understand the gravity of the situation. "If he signs contracts tomorrow, he will be committing federal wire fraud. I cannot let that happen." "Family protects family," Brenda screamed, her hands balled into tight fists. "If you do not delete those files and fix his accounts right now, you are no longer a part of this family. We will disown you, Gabrielle. We will tell everyone in Atlanta that you lost your mind and turned against us." I looked at the three of them standing together. Jasmine was weeping silently on the sofa, Calvin was pacing the floor in denial, and Brenda was glaring at me with pure hatred. They were willing to sacrifice my integrity, my company, and their own financial survival just to maintain the fake prestige Connor provided them. "No," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh, resolute whisper. "I am not protecting a parasite. I am turning this evidence over to the authorities." The moment the words left my mouth, Brenda swung her arm back and slapped me hard across the face. The sharp crack echoed through the high ceilings of the villa. My cheek burned with sudden intense heat, but I did not flinch. I did not cry. I slowly turned my head back to look at my mother. Her chest was heaving, her eyes wide with the realization of what she had just done. I raised my hand and gently touched my burning cheek. A cold, empty smile spread across my face. I looked at the people who had spent my entire life making me feel like I was never enough. I looked at the parents who chose a white con artist over their own successful black daughter. "You just made your choice," I said, my voice carrying a terrifying calm. I turned my back on them and walked over to the digital security panel mounted on the wall. I pressed the emergency lockdown protocol. The heavy oak doors of the villa automatically opened, and my private security detail stepped inside the foyer. "Escort these three individuals off my property," I instructed the guards, not looking back at my family. "They are no longer permitted in the residential wing. If they resist, call the local authorities." Brenda let out a shocked gasp as the guards firmly grasped their arms. Calvin began shouting my name, demanding. I stopped this immediately. Jasmine scrambled up from the sofa, looking absolutely terrified, as the reality of her new situation finally set in. I stood motionless in the center of the sunken living room, watching them being dragged out into the tropical heat. The doors clicked shut behind them, sealing the villa in perfect, absolute silence. The warm evening air settled over the resort as the sunset painted the sky in shades of deep purple and gold. Connor stood at the entrance of the grand oceanfront pavilion, wearing a tailored white linen suit that perfectly masked the financial ruin hiding underneath his confident posture. He had spared no expense organizing this lavish gala, using the stolen funds from my father to rent out the most exclusive event space on the island. Crystal chandeliers hung from the open-air bamboo ceilings, casting a warm glow over the carefully arranged tables of caviar and imported truffles. Waiters in crisp uniforms circulated through the crowd of wealthy tourists and elite island guests, carrying silver trays of expensive champagne. I walked up the stone pathway toward the pavilion, wearing a simple but elegant emerald evening gown. My heels clicked against the pavement, echoing my absolute determination to end this entire charade tonight. As I approached the glowing entrance, two massive men in dark suits stepped directly into my path, blocking the wide wooden doors. They crossed their thick arms over their chests, staring down at me with cold professional indifference. I recognized them immediately as local private security contractors hired outside of my own resort staff. Connor spotted me from across the entryway. A smug smile spread across his face as he excused himself from a group of wealthy older couples and strutted over to where the guards were holding me back. He looked me up and down, taking in my presence with a mixture of amusement and pure arrogance. "You really thought you could just crash my networking event?" "Gabrielle," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. This gala is for high net worth individuals looking to expand their offshore portfolios. My guest list is strictly invite only, and it certainly does not include disgruntled relatives who spend their time making up desperate lies. I kept my face completely neutral, refusing to let him see even a hint of emotion. This is my property, Connor. I replied, my tone perfectly measured and calm. You are hosting a fraudulent pitch meeting on grounds that belong to my company. You need to pack up this circus and leave before I make things incredibly difficult for you. Connor let out a loud, dramatic laugh, throwing his head back to make sure the nearby guests noticed his performance. An older white gentleman holding a glass of scotch wandered over, drawn by the commotion. Connor immediately wrapped an arm around the man, gesturing toward me with a dismissive wave of his hand. Richard, my friend. I apologize for the interruption, Connor said, turning on his fake corporate charm. This is just my wife, Sister Gabrielle. She works a little tech job back in Atlanta and likes to pretend she runs things around here. You know how it is with these diversity hires who get lucky on a few internet contracts. They suddenly think they understand the world of high finance. The investor chuckled politely, taking a sip of his drink and looking at me with mild amusement. Well, Connor, you certainly know how to handle distractions, the man said before turning back to the main party. Let me know when you are ready to discuss those guaranteed returns you promised. Connor nodded enthusiastically, waiting for the man to walk out of earshot before turning his cold, dead eyes back to me. You have no power over me here, Gabrielle. Gabrielle, he whispered, his face leaning dangerously close to mine. I am about to secure $5 million in private funding tonight. By tomorrow morning, I will own this island, and you will go back to being the invisible. Nobody. Your parents always knew you were. Now turn around and walk away before my guards physically throw you off the beach. He snapped his fingers, and the two heavy security contractors stepped even closer, practically pressing their chests against my shoulders. They were waiting for me to fight back, waiting for me to cause a scene so they could drag me away and label me as the hysterical, angry black woman trying to ruin a peaceful, elegant evening. But I did not raise my voice. I did not shove past the guards or make a single aggressive movement. I simply looked at Connor, absorbing the sheer magnitude of his toxic delusion. He truly believed his fake white corporate persona made him invincible. He believed his stolen suits and stolen money gave him the ultimate authority to erase my existence and silence my truth. I smiled, a slow, chilling smile that caused the arrogant smirk on his face to falter for just a fraction of a second. Enjoy the party, Connor, I said, my voice soft but laced with absolute certainty. I hope it is everything you imagined it would be. I turned on my heel and walked away from the glowing pavilion, leaving Connor and his hired muscle standing at the entrance. I did not walk back toward my luxury villa or head toward the lobby. Instead, I took a sharp right turn down a narrow stone path hidden behind a row of thick palm trees. The winding walkway led directly to the central nervous system of the entire resort property. I approached a solid steel door marked "Authorized Personnel Only." A biometric scanner glowed softly in the dim light beside the heavy handle. I pressed my thumb against the glass reader, and the digital lock chimed instantly, recognizing my unique access profile. The heavy door swung open, revealing a massive control room filled with server racks, glowing monitors, and complex audio-visual routing systems. Two of my top resort technicians were sitting at the main console monitoring the live feeds from across the property. They jumped up from their rolling chairs the moment I walked into the room. "Good evening, Madam Chief Executive Officer," the lead technician said quickly, stepping away from the primary workstation. "We were not expecting you down here tonight. Is there an issue with the network?" I walked past him, keeping my eyes locked on the massive grid of screens displaying the live camera feeds from the oceanfront pavilion. "There is no issue with the network," I replied, taking a seat at the master control terminal. I stared at the screen watching Connor raise his glass of champagne to the audience with one decisive keystroke. I overrode the entire gala system. The cold glow of the monitors illuminated my face as my fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard of the master control terminal. The lead technician stood silently behind me, recognizing that he was witnessing a total hostile takeover of the resort visual infrastructure. I did not hesitate as I bypassed the standard security protocols, using my administrator clearance to directly access the audio-visual routing board dedicated to the oceanfront pavilion. On the primary surveillance monitor, could see Connor pacing across the elevated bamboo stage, looking like a false prophet delivering his sermon to a congregation of billionaires. He was holding a sleek wireless clicker advancing through a series of fabricated PowerPoint slides that displayed imaginary growth charts and stolen financial projections. His voice echoed through the control room speakers, dripping with that practiced corporate charm he used to manipulate my family for years. I listened as he told the crowd of wealthy investors about his supposed background in elite wealth management, spinning a web of absolute lies about his non-existent portfolio. He paced back and forth under the crystal chandeliers, throwing out hollow corporate buzzwords about synergy and exclusive offshore holdings, while maintaining flawless eye contact with the wealthiest individuals on the island. He smiled, his perfect white teeth gleaming under the stage lights, as he instructed the waitstaff to pass out leather-bound contract folders to every table. My parents, Calvin and Brenda, were sitting in the front row, nodding along with desperate pride, completely blind to the fact that the man they worshipped was currently auctioning off their financial grave. Calvin puffed out his chest, looking around the room, while Brenda sipped expensive champagne, trying to mimic the elegant posture of the wealthy guests. Jasmine was sitting beside them, wearing a diamond necklace paid for by the stolen college funds of her abandoned children, beaming at the man who was about to destroy her life. She looked incredibly smug, believing she had finally secured her place at the absolute pinnacle of white high society. The moment Connor raised his glass of champagne to toast his inevitable success and asked the investors to open their portfolios and sign the documents, I hit the final execution key on the master terminal. The massive high-definition LED screens behind the stage flickered violently, cutting off his fraudulent presentation and replacing it with a blaring wall of digital static. The sudden shift in lighting cast a harsh, sterile glare across the entire pavilion, causing the romantic sunset ambience to instantly vanish. Connor kept his glass raised, completely unaware of the digital execution happening right behind his back. The wealthy guests stopped reaching for their expensive fountain pens, their eyes widening as the screen transitioned from fake growth charts to raw, unedited banking data. I had routed the decrypted files directly from my investigation team to the main display, highlighting Connor personal offshore accounts. The massive screen showed his true financial reality, displaying a staggering balance of absolute zero, surrounded by a long history of bounced checks and declined credit alerts. The numbers on the screen were highlighted in bright red, exposing massive overdraft fees and desperately maxed out credit lines from various shady lenders. A wave of confused murmurs rolled through the elegant crowd, prompting Connor to finally turn around and look at the screen. The champagne glass slipped from his fingers, shattering against the wooden stage as all the color instantly drained from his arrogant face. He stood frozen, staring at his own financial ruin, broadcasted in high definition to the exact people he was trying to scam. Before he could signal the sound engineer to cut the feed, the display transitioned automatically to the next document in my automated sequence. A high-resolution scan of the fraudulent second mortgage filed against my parents' home filled the massive screen, zooming in perfectly on Calvin forged signature. The digital display highlighted the corresponding wire transfer routing, the stolen equity directly into Connor personal deficit accounts to cover his collapsing Ponzi scheme. The document clearly displayed my parents' home address in Atlanta, along with the stark, bold letters of a final foreclosure notice issued by the bank. Jasmine let out a piercing, horrified scream that echoed through the entire pavilion, shattering the last remaining illusion of her perfect life. She jumped up from the front row, knocking over her chair, and scrambled onto the stage, acting like a trapped, cornered animal. Her designer heels snapped as she tripped over the microphone cables, but she kept crawling forward, desperately trying to reach the massive digital monitors. She frantically clawed at the heavy LED panels, desperately trying to find a power cord to unplug, pulling at the thick routing cables with her bare hands, Her perfectly styled hair fell into her face, and her expensive makeup smeared as she wept hysterically, thrashing against a screen that could not be turned off. Calvin and Brenda sat completely paralyzed in the front row, staring up at the foreclosure notice that proved they were now entirely bankrupt and homeless. I pushed away from the control console, leaving the resort technicians staring at the monitors in absolute stunned silence. I walked back down the hidden stone path, the warm evening breeze, catching the heavy fabric of my emerald evening gown. My footsteps were steady and unbothered, echoing with the quiet power of a woman who had meticulously planned every single second of this downfall. The two heavy security guards were still standing at the pavilion entrance, but their radios had just flared with an urgent message from the resort management confirming my absolute authority over the property. They took one look at my cold, determined expression and immediately stepped aside, bowing their heads respectfully as they opened the heavy wooden doors to let me pass. The pavilion was in pure, absolute chaos. Wealthy investors were standing up, tossing the fake investment contracts onto the floor and pointing angrily at the stage. Waiters backed away nervously, clutching their silver trays, while the sound of Jasmine wailing and ripping at cables filled the tense tropical air. Connor was still standing frozen in the center of the stage, hyperventilating as the reality of his exposure crushed the breath out of his lungs. I walked slowly, deliberately toward the stage, taking a wireless microphone from the abandoned sound mixing desk near the entrance. Several of the billionaires in the room turned to look at me, recognizing my face immediately from closed-door corporate board meetings and exclusive cybersecurity briefings. I was not an invisible nobody to these people. I was the chief executive officer they trusted with their digital empires and private estates. Whispers began to spread through the crowd as the elite guests realized the founder of Apex Elite had just walked into the room. They parted like the Red Sea, allowing me to walk straight down the center aisle without a single person blocking my path. I stepped up to the edge of the bamboo stage, looking directly into Connor, panicked, terrified eyes as I lifted the microphone. Gentlemen, the man asking for your millions just abandoned his own children at an airport to save a few bucks. Connor raised his hands, beckoning wealthy investors to open the leather-bound folders resting on their tables. He flashed a perfectly practiced white smile, radiating the fake confidence of a man who believed he had conquered the world. The ocean breeze rustled the silk curtains, adding dramatic flair to his final pitch. He leaned into the microphone stand, his voice dripping with artificial charm, urging the billionaires to sign the partnership agreements and secure their place in his exclusive portfolio, My Parents. Calvin and Brenda were leaning forward in their front row seats, practically vibrating with pride as they watched their golden son-in-law orchestrate a financial masterpiece. Jasmine sat beside them, making sure the sparkling diamond necklace she bought with her children, stolen college fund, caught the light of the crystal chandeliers. She looked around with absolute superiority, believing she had cemented her status among the global elite. Connor picked up a silver pen, holding it high as an invitation to finalize the transaction. That was the moment the massive lead panels behind him violently glitched. The romantic sunset visuals and fabricated growth charts instantly vanished, replaced by a blinding flash of digital static that bathed the entire pavilion in a harsh, sterile white light. Connor kept his arms raised, completely unaware of the digital execution unfolding directly behind his back. He assumed it was a technical glitch, maintaining his charismatic grin while waiting for the presentation to resume. But the wealthy investors stopped reaching for their pens. Their eyes widened in collective shock as the screens stabilized to reveal raw, unedited banking interfaces. I had routed the decrypted financial intelligence directly from my corporate security servers straight to the main display, highlighting Connor personal and business accounts in massive high-definition text. The screen displayed his true financial reality. It broadcasted a staggering primary account balance of absolute zero, surrounded by a long history of bounced checks and severe overdraft warnings. The display scrolled automatically, moving through dozens of maxed-out credit lines from predatory lenders, highlighting the massive deficit he had been desperately trying to hide. A low wave of confused murmurs rolled through the elegant crowd, prompting Connor to finally lower his arms and turn around to look at the screen. The silver pen slipped from his fingers, hitting the wooden stage with a dull thud. All the color instantly drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and sickly under the bright glow of his own financial ruin. He stood frozen, staring at the massive red numbers that proved he was nothing more than a broke, desperate con artist. Before he could shout for the sound engineer to cut the feed, the digital display transitioned automatically to the next piece. A high-resolution scan of the fraudulent second mortgage filed against my parents' home filled the massive screen, zooming in perfectly on Calvin forged signature. The routing numbers flashed in bright yellow, highlighting the direct wire transfer that sent the stolen home equity straight into Connor offshore shell accounts to cover his collapsing Ponzi scheme. The document clearly displayed my parents' home address in Atlanta, along with the stark bold letters of a final foreclosure notice issued by the regional bank. Jasmine let out a piercing, horrified scream that echoed through the entire pavilion, shattering the illusion of her perfect high society life. She jumped up from the front row, knocking over her wooden chair, and scrambled onto the stage, acting like a cornered animal. Her designer heels snapped as she tripped over the microphone cables, but she kept crawling forward desperately, trying to reach the massive digital monitors. She frantically clawed at the LED panels. She searched for a power cord to unplug, pulling at the thick routing wires with her bare hands. Her perfectly styled hair fell into her face, and her expensive makeup smeared across her cheeks as she wept hysterically, thrashing against a screen that simply could not be turned off. Calvin and Brenda sat completely paralyzed in the front row, staring up at the foreclosure notice that proved they were now entirely bankrupt and facing imminent homelessness. Calvin clutched his chest, his mouth opening and closing silently, while Brenda stared at the screen in pure horror, realizing the white savior they worshipped had just destroyed their entire lives. I pushed away from the control console in the hidden security room, leaving the resort technicians staring at their monitors in stunned silence. I walked back down the hidden stone path, the warm evening breeze catching the heavy fabric of my emerald evening gown. My footsteps were steady. They echoed with the quiet power of a woman who meticulously planned every second of this downfall. The two heavy security guards were still standing at the pavilion entrance, but their radios had just flared with an urgent message from resort management, confirming my absolute ownership over the property. They took one look at my cold expression and immediately stepped aside, bowing their heads respectfully as they pushed open the heavy doors to let me pass. The pavilion was in absolute chaos. Wealthy investors stood up, tossing their fake investment contracts onto the marble floor, pointing angrily at the stage. Waiters backed away nervously, clutching their silver trays, while the sound of Jasmine wailing and ripping cables filled the tropical air. Connor was still standing frozen in the center of the wooden stage, hyperventilating as the reality of his public exposure crushed the breath completely out of his own burning lungs. I walked slowly toward the stage, taking a wireless microphone from the abandoned sound mixing desk near the entrance. Billionaires turned to look, recognizing my face immediately from corporate board meetings. I was not an invisible nobody to these people. I was the chief executive officer they trusted with their digital empires. Whispers spread through the crowd as guests realized the founder of Apex Elite had walked into the room. They parted like the Red Sea, allowing me to walk straight down the center aisle without a single person blocking my path. My emerald gown swept across the floor as I approached the steps of the bamboo stage. I stepped up to the edge of the platform, looking directly into Connor. Panicked, terrified eyes. He backed away from me, stumbling over wires. Jasmine pulled loose. His corporate bravado had completely evaporated, leaving behind a pathetic, trembling shell of a man. Gentlemen, the man asking for your millions just abandoned his own children at an airport to save a few bucks. The heavy silence that followed my declaration hung over the oceanfront pavilion like a thick, suffocating cloud. The elite investors who had been moments away from signing away millions of dollars slowly lowered their hands. Their eyes shifted from the glowing LED screens displaying absolute financial ruin back down to the man sweating on the stage. Connor stood completely paralyzed, his tailored white linen suit looking incredibly foolish against the backdrop of his exposed crimes. He opened his mouth, attempting to summon that practiced corporate charm, but no sound came out. The wealthy guests began backing away, their expressions morphing from confusion into pure, unadulterated disgust. Several billionaires immediately pulled out their phones, dialing their legal teams to ensure they were distanced from this spectacular implosion. I kept my grip on the microphone, watching Connor realize his empire of lies had evaporated. "You really thought I just hacked your computer to embarrass you at a party?" I said, my voice projecting clearly across the chaotic room. "I did not just decrypt your offshore accounts. Connor, I compiled every fraudulent wire transfer, every fake portfolio document, and every stolen signature you used to drain the life savings of hardworking families back in Atlanta. I sent that data packet to the Financial Crimes Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation 24 hours ago. They have been tracking your digital footprint ever since you boarded that commercial flight you forced my parents to pay for. You are not just exposed to these investors tonight. You are entirely exposed to the full might of the federal government, and there is nowhere left to hide." The color vanished completely from Connor's face, leaving him looking pale and utterly terrified. He stumbled backward, tripping over a loose audio cable on the bamboo stage. Jasmine was still sobbing near the front row, but her cries were drowned out by the sudden sound of heavy boots marching up the stone pathway leading to the pavilion entrance. 4 uniformed officers from the local island police department strode into the event space, their faces set in grim professional determination. They were accompanied by 2 plainclothes detectives wearing tactical vests. The elite guests stepped aside, creating a wide, clear path for law enforcement to reach the stage. I calmly lowered the microphone and stepped back into the shadows, allowing the authorities to take over the scene I had meticulously prepared. Connor saw the police officers approaching, and a desperate shift occurred in his demeanor. He tried to pull together the shattered pieces of his fake high society persona. He smoothed down the lapels of his white linen suit and adjusted his silk tie, forcing an artificial smile onto his sweating face. He stepped forward to meet the officers at the edge of the stage, projecting the arrogant authority of a wealthy white corporate executive who believed the rules did not apply to him. "Gentlemen, there has been a massive misunderstanding here," Connor said, his voice dripping with condescension and unearned privilege. "I am a highly respected wealth manager from the United States, and this woman is just a disgruntled relative having a severe mental health episode. She hacked the audio-visual system to display fake documents. You can escort her off the property, and I will ensure your department receives a generous donation for your trouble." He reached into his jacket pocket, assuming his perceived status would instantly command their absolute obedience. The local police officers did not even blink. They did not smile back, and they certainly did not entertain his arrogant attempt at bribery. The lead detective stepped onto the bamboo stage, completely ignoring Connor's outstretched hand. "We are not here for a noise complaint," the detective stated, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "We are executing an international extradition warrant issued in coordination with the United States Federal Bureau of Investigation. You are wanted for massive wire fraud, money laundering, and interstate financial crimes. Put your hands behind your back immediately." Connor's corporate facade shattered in an instant. The arrogant white privilege he had weaponized against my family for years meant nothing in the face of federal criminal charges. He took a step backward, shaking his head in denial. "Do you have any idea who I am?" Connor shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "You cannot do this to me. I have powerful connections. I demand to speak to the American embassy right now." The local officers did not hesitate. 2 uniformed guards lunged forward, grabbing Connor by the shoulders and slamming him face first onto the bamboo stage. His linen suit tore at the seams as they forcefully pinned his arms behind his back. The metallic click of steel handcuffs echoing through the silent pavilion was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard in my life. Jasmine screamed hysterically from the front row, watching her wealthy husband being treated like a common criminal. She tried to run toward the stage, but a female officer blocked her path, ordering her to stay back. Calvin and Brenda stood frozen in their seats, watching the man they worshipped, the man they had sacrificed their own daughter to protect being dragged across the floor by his silk tie. Connor thrashed against the heavy grips of the police officers, his face scraped and bleeding from the bamboo floor. He looked out into the crowd, his eyes wide with terror, realizing his life of luxury was over. He was going to spend decades in a federal prison cell, and he was not going to go down alone. Connor locked eyes with my father, who was trembling violently in the front row. The golden son-in-law twisted his body toward the detectives, his face contorted in a mask of vicious betrayal. "Do not just arrest me," Connor screamed, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "I did not do this alone. Calvin Hayes signed the mortgage documents. Calvin Hayes authorized the transfers. He is my business partner and my legal co-signer. He knew exactly where the money was coming from and he helped me hide it. Arrest him too." The heavy silence in the pavilion shattered completely as the two plainclothes detectives slowly turned their heads, shifting their cold, intense gaze directly onto my father. Calvin World instantly collapsed as he realized the white savior he idolized had just served him up to the federal government on a silver platter. The tropical heat of the pavilion felt suffocating as every eye in the room shifted from Connor struggling in steel handcuffs to my father sitting completely paralyzed in the front row. Calvin had spent his entire life building a respectable image as a pillar of our church community, an upstanding father who demanded absolute perfection from his children. He worshipped Connor, treating him like a white savior who would elevate our family status to untouchable heights. Now that same savior was bleeding on the bamboo floor, desperately dragging my father down into the flames of a federal indictment. I watched Calvin process the betrayal in real time. His chest heaved and his hands gripped his knees so tightly, his knuckles turned a sickly shade of gray. He looked at Connor, then looked at the two plainclothes detectives, who were slowly walking down the center aisle toward him. The lead detective stopped right in front of my father, pulling out a small notepad and asking if he wanted to explain his involvement in the offshore shell accounts. Panic completely took over Calvin's mind, bypassing any remaining shred of parental loyalty or basic human decency. He scrambled out of his chair, pointing a trembling finger across the pavilion directly at me. "It was not me," Calvin shouted, his voice echoing with desperate, frantic energy. "I am a victim here just like the rest of these people. I do not know anything about offshore accounts or wire fraud. I am just an old man trying to secure his retirement. You are looking at the wrong person. You need to look at my daughter Gabrielle. She is the one who did this. She orchestrated everything to frame Connor because she is a bitter, jealous woman." The entire room gasped as my own father threw me to the federal authorities without a single moment of hesitation. Brenda grabbed his arm, trying to pull him back, but Calvin shook her off, completely consumed by his desperate need for self-preservation. He stepped closer to the detectives, continuing his fabricated story with terrifying conviction. "Gabrielle runs a massive cybersecurity firm." Calvin stammered, pointing frantically at my emerald access to all of my personal banking portals. "I gave her my passwords years ago so she could help me manage my digital accounts. She used her company servers to initiate those fraudulent wire transfers. She stole the equity from my house and routed it through Connor's business profile to make it look like he committed the crime. She wants to destroy her sister's marriage because she has always been the outcast of this family." I stood on the edge of the stage, looking down at the man who was supposed to protect me. He was actively lying to federal agents, trying to send his youngest daughter to a maximum security prison just to save his own skin and protect the illusion of his perfect family. The sheer magnitude of his betrayal washed over me, but it did not break my heart. It simply confirmed what I had known for over a decade. As I watched him weave his pathetic web of lies, my mind pulled me back to a rainy night in Atlanta 13 years ago. I was 16 years old, standing soaking wet on the side of a suburban road, watching the flashing red and blue lights of a police cruiser. Jasmine had been driving our mother car, completely intoxicated, coming home from a senior party she was explicitly forbidden from attending. She lost control, taking a sharp turn, and crashed the sedan straight through a brick mailbox, shattering the windshield and deploying the airbags. When Calvin arrived at the scene of the accident before the police could run a breathalyzer test, he pulled me out of the passenger seat and shoved me behind the steering wheel. Jasmine had an interview with the admissions board of an Ivy League university the very next morning. A driving under the influence charge would have ruined her pristine record and destroyed Calvin's dream of bragging about his golden daughter. So he lied to the responding officers. He told them I took the car without permission and crashed it because I was a reckless teenager. I took the blame. I paid the fines from my summer job savings, and I carried the permanent stain of disappointment while Jasmine went off to her elite college without a single consequence. Calvin sacrificed my reputation to save her future, and he was trying to do the exact same thing right now. I snapped back to the present moment, letting the cold island breeze brush against my face. I did not scream or cry. I did not try to defend myself against his ridiculous accusations. I simply walked down the wooden steps of the stage and approached the two detectives. Calvin continued his frantic rambling, detailing how my tech company possessed the exact hacking capabilities required to bypass banking security protocols. He painted me as a digital mastermind, using my corporate infrastructure to ruin an innocent wealth manager. Jasmine stopped crying and eagerly nodded along with the lie, suddenly finding a new spark of hope. She grabbed the arm of the nearest police officer, sobbing dramatically as she claimed I had been threatening their family all week and demanding they leave the island. The sheer desperation of their combined lies was almost impressive in its toxic coordination. The lead detective held up his hand, silencing my father's frantic rambling. He turned his intense gaze toward me, studying my calm, unbothered expression. Miss Gabrielle, the detective, said, his voice thick with professional skepticism. Your father is making some very serious allegations regarding your involvement in these financial crimes. Given your position as the chief executive officer of a cybersecurity firm, you certainly possess the technical means to execute these transfers. We are going to need to confiscate your personal and corporate devices immediately to verify these claims. Do you understand that interfering with a federal investigation will result in immediate detention? Calvin let out a breath of relief, believing he had redirected the crosshairs from his failures. Jasmine wiped her makeup, offering a vicious smirk. They thought they had backed me into a corner. I did not fight the detectives. I reached into my gown, pulled out my laptop, and handed it over with a confident smirk, knowing exactly what they would find. The lead detective took the sleek metal laptop from my outstretched hands, resting it carefully on the nearest empty wooden cocktail table. The pavilion was so incredibly quiet, you could hear the ocean waves crashing against the sandy beach outside. Every single wealthy guest and island official held their breath, watching the federal authorities prepare to examine my digital life. The plainclothes cyber agent stepped forward, pulling a specialized decryption drive from his tactical vest and sliding it into the side port of my machine. He expected to encounter massive firewalls and hidden folders designed to obscure financial crimes. I did not make them fight through my security architecture. I simply leaned over the table, typed in my long master administrator passcode, and opened the primary Apex Elite server dashboard for them to review. I took one step back, smoothing the fabric of my emerald gown, crossing my arms and waiting for the inevitable truth to surface. Calvin was breathing heavily, leaning his body weight against the edge of the bamboo stage. He looked over at Jasmine, who was wiping away her fake tears and standing just a little bit taller. They were both staring at me with desperate anticipation, waiting for the metallic click of steel handcuffs to snap around my wrists. Connor was still bleeding on the floor, but he managed a pathetic wet smile, thinking my father had just bought him a miraculous way out of federal prison. They genuinely believed their coordinated lies would be enough to manipulate the authorities and erase my existence one final time. I looked back at them, projecting absolutely nothing but cold, unwavering certainty. I knew the digital traps I set were flawless, and I was more than ready to watch them fall right into the abyss they dug themselves. The federal cyber agent scrolled through the massive lines of code and time-stamped event logs displayed on my screen. His eyes darted back and forth, processing the raw, encrypted data, routing histories, and banking access points. The blue light from the monitor reflected off his face as the silence in the room grew heavier. Suddenly, he stopped scrolling. He tapped the glass of the screen, pointing at a specific sequence of secure socket layer logs. The lead detective leaned over his shoulder, his brow furrowing as he read the highlighted text. The detective slowly stood up straight, tearing his eyes away from the screen and shifting his intense gaze directly back to my father. The detective stated in a loud, booming voice that the Apex Elite servers did not initiate a single fraudulent wire transfer to any offshore account. He announced to the entire pavilion that the digital logs proved the exact opposite of Calvin's ridiculous accusations. My corporate security infrastructure did not facilitate the theft. My system actually detected a massive anomaly in the banking routing numbers tying back to my family and automatically triggered a hostile breach protocol. The detective read directly from the screen, confirming that my servers placed a hard freeze on the final sequence of the mortgage transfer. My technology actively blocked the last $100,000 from leaving the United States and immediately generated a suspicious activity report, sending it straight to the federal authorities. Calvin shook his head aggressively, refusing to accept reality. He stomped his foot against the floor, insisting the logs must be forged or manipulated by my team. He demanded the federal agents look closer at the origin of the initial transfer authorizations, claiming I must have used a proxy server to hide my tracks. The cyber agent complied without hesitation, running a deep trace on the digital signature attached to the fraudulent second mortgage document. The agent typed several commands into the terminal, pulling the exact geographic location and hardware identification tied to the very first illegal login. The agent looked up from the laptop and announced that the initial banking access did not come from my corporate servers or any of my personal devices. The digital ping originated from a residential internet protocol address located in Atlanta, Georgia. Calvin pointed at me triumphantly, shouting that I must have hacked his home network remotely from my apartment. But the federal agent shook his head, pulling up the device identification registry to deliver the final crushing blow. The agent read the hardware identification number out loud, stating that the unauthorized access was executed on a rose gold smartphone. He cross-referenced the serial number with the telecommunications database and confirmed the device was registered directly to Jasmine. The location data proved she was sitting physically inside Calvin's living room connected to his private home network when she logged into his banking portal. She used his trusted internet connection to deliberately bypass the bank geographic security filters. She actively forged Calvin's digital signature while sitting under his own roof to approve the catastrophic loan that would fund her fake luxury lifestyle with Connor. Jasmine's face turned the color of wet ash. She took a step backward, bumping hard into a wooden chair. She opened her mouth trying to formulate a desperate lie, but the digital footprint was absolute and completely undeniable. She did not just passively enjoy the stolen money her husband brought home. She actively betrayed her own father, securing the financial ruin of her parents just to buy designer bags and maintain her artificial high society image. She sacrificed the people who worshipped her just to protect a white con artist. The crowd of wealthy guests watched her squirm in absolute silence, judging her pathetic attempt to play the victim, now that the irrefutable truth was shining brightly on the screens above. Calvin heard the federal agent explain exactly how his golden daughter used his unconditional trust to steal his home. He realized he just tried to send his innocent, successful daughter to a federal prison, while the real criminal was standing right beside him, wearing diamonds bought with his stolen equity. The absolute weight of his catastrophic failure crashed down on him, crushing the strength right out of his legs. He collapsed to his knees, hitting the bamboo floor with a heavy thud. The sound of his knees striking the wood echoed like a final devastating gavel drop, signaling the end of his perfect family. Brenda looked away from the digital screens and slowly turned her gaze toward Jasmine, staring at her favorite child in pure, unadulterated horror. The humid ocean breeze whipped across the wooden planks of the private marina as Jasmine desperately dragged her two children toward the docking slips. She had abandoned her broken designer heels somewhere near the Grand Pavilion and was now running barefoot over the rough timber. Her expensive makeup was completely ruined, stained across her cheeks in dark, jagged streaks, but she did not care about her high society image anymore. She was running purely on blind panic and selfish desperation. Connor was currently sitting in a concrete holding cell on the other side of the tropical island, and Jasmine knew the federal agents would be coming for her next. She gripped the delicate wrists of her 6-year-old twins so tightly that Amara began to whimper in genuine pain. Jamal stumbled over his own feet repeatedly, trying to keep up with his mother's frantic pace. Jasmine ignored their crying, pulling them ruthlessly toward a sleek luxury speedboat tied to the final slip at the end of the pier. She planned to bribe the local boat captain to smuggle them across the dark water to the commercial airport on the neighboring island, where she hoped to catch a red-eye flight back to the United States before the extradition paperwork officially caught up with her. She genuinely believed she could just run away from the massive financial disaster she helped create, leaving everyone else to suffer the devastating consequences of her reckless greed. Jasmine shoved her entire body weight against the heavy wooden gate leading to the boarding ramp, but the sturdy barrier did not budge. The digital lock hummed with a solid red light, completely denying her access to the private vessels. She slammed her bare hands against the metal gate, screaming for the dockmaster to come out from the cabin and start the boat engines. Before she could shout another desperate demand, the bright halogen security lights mounted high above the marina suddenly flickered on, bathing the entire dock in a harsh, blinding glow. I stepped out from the deep shadows of the boathouse, flanked by 4 of my private tactical security guards. I was no longer wearing my emerald evening gown. I had changed into a tailored charcoal business suit, projecting the absolute authority of a corporate executive dealing with a hostile threat. I walked slowly down the wooden dock, the rhythmic sound of my footsteps cutting clearly through the noise of the crashing ocean waves. My security team fanned out seamlessly, creating a solid human wall between Jasmine and the water. There was no boat ride waiting for her tonight, and there was no escape route left to exploit. Jasmine took a sudden step backward, pulling the exhausted twins behind her legs, as if she was trying to protect them from me. The deep irony of her sudden maternal instinct was absolutely sickening, considering she had completely abandoned them in an airport terminal just 2 days ago. She glared at me with pure, unadulterated venom, her chest heaving as she struggled to catch her breath in the humid air. "Get out of my way, Gabrielle!" Jasmine hissed, her voice cracking with severe exhaustion and overwhelming fear. "You have already ruined my husband and destroyed my parents tonight. You are not going to trap me on this island like a criminal. I am taking my children back to Atlanta right now, and we are going to fight all of these ridiculous allegations in a court of law." I kept my face perfectly still, refusing to give her the emotional reaction she desperately wanted. "You are not going anywhere, Jasmine," I replied, my tone calm and perfectly measured. "Connor is currently sitting in a police interrogation room, providing the federal authorities with a very detailed confession. He is explaining exactly how you used your father's internet connection to forge the mortgage documents and steal the equity from your own parents. The local police are already preparing the formal accessory charges against you. If you try to flee this jurisdiction, they will issue an international red notice, and you will be forcefully arrested the moment you step off any commercial flight." The harsh reality of her trapped situation washed over her, but instead of showing any remorse, Jasmine doubled down on her toxic manipulation. She grabbed Jamal by his small shoulders, pulling him forcefully to her side. "If you do not let me on that boat right now, I swear to you, Gabrielle, I will make sure these kids hate you for the rest of their natural lives." Jasmine threatened, her voice dripping with pure malice. "I will tell them exactly what you did tonight. I will tell them you are a jealous, lonely monster who framed their successful father and tore their perfect family apart just because you were bitter. They will grow up knowing you are the ultimate villain in our story. They will never look at you with anything but absolute disgust. You might have corporate money and private resorts, but you will always be the miserable sister who destroyed our happiness because no man ever loved you." Amara began to cry much louder, hiding her tear-stained face against her brother's shoulder, terrified by the vicious anger radiating from her mother. Jamal looked up at me with wide, scared eyes, silently begging for someone to save them from this terrible nightmare. I did not break eye contact with my sister. I raised my right hand and gestured silently to my security team. 2 of the highly trained guards stepped forward swiftly and professionally, separating Jasmine from the crying children. Jasmine screamed and kicked, thrashing wildly against their solid grips, but they easily moved her aside without hurting her. A female security officer gently knelt down, taking Jamal and Amara by the hands and leading them away from the edge of the dangerous dock toward the absolute safety of the main resort building. Jasmine struggled against the guards, watching her last remaining source of emotional leverage being walked away into the night. "You cannot take my children from me," Jasmine screamed, her voice echoing across the dark, choppy water. "You have no legal right to touch them. I am their biological mother. You are kidnapping my kids, and I will have you thrown in a federal prison for this." I reached into the breast pocket of my charcoal blazer and pulled out a thick, folded legal document. I walked right up to my sister, stopping just inches from her panicked, sweating face. I slowly unfolded the crisp white papers and held them up to the bright halogen security light so she could clearly read the bold federal seal printed at the very top of the page. "I do not need to kidnap them, Jasmine," I stated, my voice echoing with absolute legal authority over the sound of the ocean. "I simply provided the United States Family Court with the high-definition security footage from the Atlanta airport. I showed a federal judge exactly how you and your fraudulent husband abandoned two helpless 6-year-old children in a commercial departure terminal just so you could drink champagne on a stolen luxury vacation. The judge was absolutely horrified by your gross parental negligence and immediate flight risk." I handed the heavy document to Jasmine, watching her trembling fingers brush against the thick paper. "That is an emergency temporary guardianship order granted directly by a federal judge," I explained, watching the last remaining shred of her artificial world crumble into dust. "You do not have custody of Jamal and Amara anymore, Jasmine." "I do." I stood in the busiest airport staring at a text message that shattered my understanding of family. It was the morning of our highly anticipated luxury vacation to the Caribbean, and the ticketing agent had just told me my flight was canceled. Not delayed, but deliberately canceled by my own sister. I looked at my phone, reading her words over and over again. "You should be taking care of the kids this week anyway. Do not try to follow us." Right. Next to that message was a photo of my 6-year-old niece and nephew sitting on a mountain of luggage in the departure terminal, abandoned and alone, while my sister and her husband sipped champagne, flying toward a tropical paradise. They had no idea they had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. They thought they left behind a socially awkward computer nerd who would just quietly obey their commands. They had no clue the resort they were flying to was secretly owned by the company I built. The fluorescent lights of the Atlanta International Airport buzzed above my head as I rushed toward the first-class check-in counter. My name is Gabrielle, and at 29 years old, I packed carefully, selecting elegant outfits to blend in with my sister Jasmine and her husband Connor. Connor was a wealth manager my parents treated like royalty. Every holiday dinner revolved around his high society connections, while my parents ignored my presence entirely. When I handed my passport to the attendant, her painted smile faltered instantly. She typed furiously on her keyboard before looking up with a look of genuine pity. "I am so sorry, Mom, but your ticket to St. Bart's was canceled late last night by the primary account holder." I blinked, trying to process the shocking information. Before I could demand an explanation, a sharp cry caught my attention. I turned and recognized the unmistakable sound of my niece Amara crying. I abandoned the ticketing counter and sprinted toward the seating area near the security gates. There, huddled together on a cold metal bench, were Jamal and Amara. My 6-year-old twin nephew and niece were crying softly, their tiny hands gripping the handles of heavy suitcases. They looked terrified and lost in the sea of rushing travelers. I pulled them both into a tight, comforting embrace. "Where is your mother?" I asked, keeping my voice calm. Jamal wiped his running nose. "Mommy and Daddy said we had to wait here for you because kids are too loud for Daddy business friends." Rage, hot and sudden, flared deep in my chest. I pulled out my phone and dialed my mother, Brenda. She and my father, Calvin, had flown out on the same flight with Jasmine and Connor. The line rang several times before my mother answered, her voice layered with the noise of an aircraft cabin. "Mom, what is going on?" I demanded. "I am at the airport and my ticket is canceled." Jasmine left the twins sitting by the security gate alone. I heard a heavy, annoyed sigh on the other end. "Stop overreacting, Gabrielle." My mother snapped, her tone dripping with the same condescension I had endured my entire life. "Jasmine and Connor work exhausting corporate jobs. They deal with wealthy executives all day and deserve a stress-free vacation without children crying. You just stare at screens all day running that internet hobby of yours. You have no real grown-up responsibilities." Take the kids back to your apartment and watch them for the week. I gripped the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. Mom, they abandoned two small children in a public airport. My mother lowered her voice. Connor is meeting important business partners at the resort this week. He is securing our family future. You know how awkward you get around successful people, Gabrielle. Your social anxiety would just ruin his image. Do not make this about you for once. Be a good aunt, take the kids home and stay quiet. She hung up the call before I could defend myself. I stood there listening to the dial tone. For 29 years, I let them treat me like the invisible scapegoat. I let them worship Connor simply because he wore expensive suits and came from a privileged world they wanted to belong to. They thought my cybersecurity and property management firm was just a freelance gig because I never bragged about my income. They assumed my quiet nature meant I was weak and unsuccessful. They wrote me off as the weird tech girl who would never measure up to the perfection of Jasmine. I looked down at Jamal and Amara staring up at me with sad, tearful eyes. "Are we going home, Auntie Gabby?" Amara asked, her voice trembling. I took a deep breath, letting the decades of hurt and submission wash completely away. I was done shrinking myself to make my family comfortable. I was done letting them prioritize a fake image over their own flesh and blood. I knelt down, wiping a stray tear from Amara's cheek. "No, sweetie," I said, offering them a warm, genuine smile. "We are not going home, we are going on a vacation." I grabbed their suitcases and guided the twins away from the commercial ticketing counters. We bypassed the security lines, walking directly to the private aviation sector of the airport. The atmosphere here was different, hushed, peaceful, and dripping with exclusivity. I walked straight up to the private flight concierge desk. The attendant looked up, ready to ask if I was lost in the wrong terminal. Instead, I reached into my leather wallet and pulled out a solid obsidian black corporate card, sliding it smoothly across the polished marble counter. The attendant saw the name engraved on the metal Apex Elite Holdings, and her posture straightened into professionalism. "Good morning, Madam Chief Executive Officer," she said, her voice filled with absolute respect. "How can we assist you today?" "Get my jet ready," I instructed, my voice colder and more powerful than it had ever sounded. "We are going to St. Bart's." I picked up my phone, opened my private company security app, and disabled every single credit profile associated with my sister and her husband. "Let us see how far that privilege gets you when the money runs out," I whispered as we walked toward the tarmac. The slip of paper fluttered slowly through the humid island air, landing softly against the polished bamboo floorboards. Calvin stared down at the crisp corporate check displaying the absolute zero balance, his hands shaking violently at his sides. Brenda let out a choked, suffocating gasp, clutching her chest, as the harsh reality of my absolute refusal completely paralyzed her. They had fully expected me to save them. They had genuinely believed I would open my endless corporate bank accounts and rescue them from the catastrophic financial apocalypse they actively helped create. They expected the invisible scapegoat daughter to finally prove her worth by buying back their stolen dignity and paying off their massive debts. I stood on the edge of the stage, looking down at the three of them, stripped of their arrogant pride and their fake high society armor. "For decades, you made me feel like an unwelcome stranger inside my own home," I said, my voice steady and projecting clearly across the empty pavilion space. "You treated my quiet, thoughtful nature as a severe character defect. You worshipped Jasmine simply because she was loud and perfectly willing to play the superficial social games you valued above all else. But it was never just about our differing personalities, was it?" I walked slowly down the wooden steps, the heavy fabric of my emerald evening gown sweeping across the floor as I approached my trembling parents. "It was about how desperately you wanted to distance yourselves from your own roots. You craved elite status so badly that you internalized the worst kind of prejudice against your own flesh and blood. You spent my entire childhood criticizing my natural hair, my modest clothes, and my quiet dedication to my computer science studies, while you praised Jasmine for assimilating into circles that only valued her as a token accessory. You constantly told me I needed to soften my presence to make others comfortable, while you cheered for Jasmine every time she diminished someone else to climb the social ladder. You told me my ambitions in the technology sector were just an embarrassing phase because a black woman like me would never be welcomed in those corporate boardrooms. You projected all of your own deep-seated insecurities directly onto my shoulders, hoping I would fail, just to validate your narrow worldview. You wanted me to remain small so your massive ego could feel adequately protected. Calvin opened his mouth to defend himself, but no words materialized. He simply stared at me, his eyes wide with the horrifying realization that I saw completely through his lifelong facade. I took another step closer, forcing my father to look me directly in the eyes. You looked at a white man in a tailored suit, and you immediately surrendered your common sense. I continued, my tone laced with absolute disgust. You gave Connor your absolute trust, your home equity, and your fierce parental loyalty, simply because of his perceived pedigree. You blindly believed his whiteness, and his practiced corporate jargon made him inherently superior to the highly successful black daughter standing right in front of you. You let him sit at the head of our dinner table every holiday, hanging on every hollow word he spoke about his imaginary investment portfolios. You practically bowed to him, treating him like a god, simply because he tossed around terms like offshore dividends and capital gains. You never once asked to see a single legitimate financial statement or proof of his supposed corporate standing because you were too intimidated by his race and his arrogant confidence. You let him disrespect me in my own childhood home, and you smiled while he did it. You were so desperate for proximity to his fake privilege that you willingly sacrificed my mental health, my reputation, and eventually the safety of your own grandchildren just to keep him happy. Jasmine tried to speak, her voice trembling violently as she attempted to formulate another pathetic emotional excuse to manipulate the situation. I did not let her utter a single syllable. I shifted my intense gaze directly to her, watching her shrink visibly under the crushing weight of her own miserable choices. You spent your entire miserable life tearing me down to build yourself up, Jasmine, I stated coldly, watching the tears streak through her ruined, expensive makeup. You married a parasite because he looked the part on your carefully curated social media feeds. You knew he was a fraud long before tonight, Jasmine. You saw the foreclosure notices and the panicked emails, but you looked the other way because you could not bear the thought of losing your country club memberships and your fake elite friends. You sold your soul for a lifestyle you never earned. You happily spent stolen money to buy designer handbags while actively ruining your parents' financial future. You are a terrible mother and an even worse sister. You pushed down everyone around you thinking it would elevate your status, but all it did was leave you standing alone in the dirt. Brenda reached out her hands, trembling uncontrollably as she desperately begged me to reconsider her pleading, echoing through the quiet tropical night. She sobbed that family should always forgive one another and that blood should mean something in the end. I stepped back, completely repulsed by her sudden conditional definition of love and family loyalty. You do not know the absolute meaning of the word family, I replied, my tone dropping to a deadly calm register that silenced her frantic weeping. You worshipped a man who stole your future simply because of his pedigree. You abandoned your blood. I owe you nothing. The sheer finality of my words hit them with the devastating force of a physical blow. Calvin dropped his head, weeping openly, as the sheer magnitude of his complete financial and social ruin finally crushed the remaining strength out of his legs. Brenda collapsed against his shoulder, sobbing uncontrollably into his ruined shirt. Jasmine stood completely alone, shivering in the warm tropical breeze, realizing her artificial empire had vanished into thin air. I turned my back on the three of them, raising my right hand to signal my private tactical team standing by the pavilion perimeter. Escort these individuals off the resort property immediately. I instructed the lead security guard, not bothering to look back at the broken family, sobbing on the floor. Gather their remaining luggage from the front lobby and remove them from my premises permanently. If they attempt to re-enter the grounds or contact me, you are authorized to involve the local authorities for trespassing. Jasmine let out a panicked, terrified shriek, realizing the absolute severity of their current logistical situation. Wait, you cannot just throw us out onto the street, she screamed, struggling against the firm grip of the approaching security guards. How are we supposed to get home? Their credit cards were completely frozen by my cybersecurity team. Their primary bank accounts were officially locked by federal authorities, conducting the financial crimes investigation. They had absolutely zero cash on hand, having relied entirely on the stolen funds Connor usually managed. As the heavy guards grabbed their arms and marched them forcefully toward the exit pathway, they finally realized they had absolutely no way to pay for a commercial flight back to the United States. They were completely stranded on a playground, designed exclusively for the ultra-wealthy, with no resources, no connections, and no white savior left to rescue them from the terrifying consequences of their own toxic actions. I watched them being dragged away into the dark tropical night, feeling absolutely nothing but pure, unadulterated peace. The harsh fluorescent lights of the small island airport flickered relentlessly, casting a sickly yellow glow over the hard plastic waiting benches. Jasmine shifted uncomfortably, trying to rest her aching neck. She was wearing the ruined designer dress, her bare feet blistered from running across the docks. Calvin and Brenda sat silent, staring blankly at the scuffed linoleum floor. They had been trapped inside the humid terminal for over 14 hours with no access to food. The authorities had seized all of Connor's physical assets, leaving them with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Without my corporate credit cards, they were suddenly reduced to begging the ticketing agents for the cheapest standby economy seats available on the next flight. Brenda clutched her empty stomach, shivering slightly, realizing she was experiencing the exact same helpless abandonment she had happily inflicted upon her own grandchildren just 3 days ago. Calvin kept checking his dead smartphone, hoping for some kind of miraculous intervention that was never going to come. He had sacrificed his entire financial future to protect a white con artist, and now he was facing the terrifying reality of returning to Atlanta with zero equity and a looming federal investigation. He slowly lifted his head and looked at his golden daughter. He saw a selfish, reckless accomplice who had actively forged his signature and stolen his home. Jasmine felt his intense, heavy gaze and curled her body tighter, hiding her ruined face behind her tangled, unwashed hair. She knew her father was finally seeing her true colors. The silence between them was suffocating, built on a foundation of mutual betrayal and catastrophic greed. The morning terminal gradually began to fill with wealthy tourists, returning home from their tropical vacations. Jasmine kept her head down, praying she would blend in with the exhausted travelers. She desperately wanted to remain invisible, but the universe had a very different plan. A loud burst of familiar laughter echoed from the nearby duty-free shop. Jasmine froze, recognizing the distinct high-pitched voices immediately. Walking down the main concourse were Sydney and Taylor, two prominent social media influencers from Atlanta who had attended Connor fraudulent gala the night before. They were exactly the type of superficial friends Jasmine had spent her entire adult life trying to impress. Jasmine panicked, sliding off the plastic bench and trying to hide her face behind a discarded newspaper. Sydney stopped walking, her designer sunglasses slipping down the bridge of her nose as she spotted the pathetic figure crouching on the airport floor. She tapped Taylor on the shoulder, pointing directly at Jasmine. They did not rush over to offer help. Instead, they both pulled out their expensive smartphones and immediately opened their social media applications. They hit the record buttons, capturing every single humiliating second of Jasmine hiding behind a crumpled newspaper with her bare, dirty feet exposed on the linoleum floor. Sydney narrated the live broadcast to her massive following, mocking the fallen queen of Atlanta high society. She loudly described how Jasmine's husband was currently sitting in a Caribbean jail cell for running a massive Ponzi scheme while his fake wealthy wife was sleeping on the floor of a public terminal. Jasmine dropped the newspaper, exposing her tear-stained face to the glowing camera lenses. She scrambled to her feet, holding her hands up to block the recordings, but Sydney and Taylor just stepped back and continued filming the pathetic display. They zoomed in on her wrinkled dress and the cheap economy boarding pass clutched tightly in her trembling fingers. Taylor loudly announced to her followers that the golden couple was nothing but a pathetic fraud, warning everyone in their social circle to check their bank accounts. Jasmine begged them to stop recording, sobbing hysterically as she realized her entire fake empire was completely dead. The videos were already uploading to the internet, broadcasting her absolute destruction to every single person she had ever looked down upon. The final boarding call for the budget airline echoed over the terminal intercom, signaling the end of their Caribbean nightmare. The ticketing agent announced that the remaining standby passengers could now proceed to the gate. Calvin slowly pushed himself up from the plastic bench, his spirit completely broken. He grabbed his own small suitcase and shuffled slowly toward the economy boarding line, looking like a man marching toward his own execution. Brenda followed closely behind him, keeping her eyes glued to the floor. Jasmine wiped away the last traces of her expensive foundation and dragged her luggage toward the gate. She handed her cheap paper ticket to the attendant, feeling the ultimate sting of degradation. There were no priority boarding lanes for her today. She squeezed her way down the narrow aisle until she reached her assigned middle seat, right next to the loud churning engine. The cramped economy seat felt like a physical punishment against Jasmine's exhausted body. She squeezed her knees together, trying to avoid touching the passengers beside her, while the stale recycled air blew directly into her face. Calvin and Brenda were seated several rows ahead, trapped in equally miserable conditions. Jasmine leaned her heavy head against the scratched plastic window, staring out at the sun-baked tarmac. The commercial airplane engines roared to life, shaking the entire cabin with a violent vibration. She closed her eyes, wishing she could wake up from this devastating reality and return to the luxury villa she had arrogantly claimed as her own. But the harsh vibration of the cheap plastic seat offered zero escape from the consequences of her terrible actions. As the massive commercial airliner slowly taxied down the runway, moving into position for takeoff, Jasmine opened her eyes and looked out the small, scratched window one final time. Across the wide expanse of the tropical tarmac, parked exclusively in the private aviation sector, sat a gleaming state-of-the-art corporate jet. The ground crew was pulling away the red carpet boarding stairs, while the powerful jet engines hummed with quiet, elite precision. Jasmine pressed her face against the cold plastic glass, her breath fogging up the window as she recognized the dark obsidian logo of Apex Elite painted proudly on the tailfin. She watched in absolute agonizing silence as the private jet smoothly accelerated down the private runway, lifting effortlessly into the clear blue Caribbean sky. She knew exactly who was sitting inside that luxurious cabin. She knew I was relaxing in a plush leather seat, drinking fresh juice and reading stories to Jamal and Amara, flying them safely back to a life of absolute security and unconditional love. Jasmine watched my jet disappear into the clouds, realizing she had traded a lifetime of guaranteed protection and genuine family loyalty for a fake white savior who left her completely empty-handed. Exactly 1 month later, the tropical island breeze was nothing but a distant memory, replaced by the harsh, unforgiving reality of the federal justice system. Connor sat in a windowless detention center in downtown Atlanta, wearing a standard-issue orange jumpsuit. His tailored white linen suits and expensive leather shoes were gone, permanently confiscated, along with his fake high society persona. The federal judge completely denied his bail application, citing him as an extreme flight risk after the catastrophic gala incident in the Caribbean. He spent his days sitting on a hard concrete bench, staring at a metal toilet, realizing his golden white privilege held absolutely no power inside a federal holding cell. His offshore accounts were entirely seized by the government, and his wealthy investors were actively cooperating with the prosecution to ensure he spent the next few decades locked behind steel bars. Jasmine was not living much better than her fraudulent husband. The former undisputed queen of Atlanta high society now resided in a damp, run-down motel on the miserable outskirts of the city. The luxurious diamond necklaces and designer handbags she bought with stolen college funds were all seized by federal authorities to help pay back the defrauded church members. She sat on a sagging mattress staring at peeling yellow wallpaper while listening to the loud rumble of traffic from the nearby interstate highway. She was officially facing multiple accessory to wire fraud charges. Her elite influencer friends had entirely abandoned her, blocking her number and deleting every single photo they ever took together. She was completely isolated, waiting for an overworked public defender to call her back with a pathetic plea deal. Calvin and Brenda lost their final desperate appeal against the regional bank. The massive foreclosure notice pinned to their front door became a permanent, devastating reality when the eviction team arrived to physically remove their remaining belongings. They packed their clothes into cheap cardboard boxes, watching the bank officially seize the home they worked 30 years to build. Their church community, the very people they tried so desperately to impress, completely turned their backs on them after learning how Calvin facilitated the fraudulent mortgage that funded the Ponzi scheme. They were entirely homeless, desperate, and rapidly running out of options with no white savior left to rescue them from the dirt. Calvin and Brenda decided to play their final manipulative card. They took a public city bus to the towering glass and steel corporate headquarters of Apex Elite Holdings. They did not come alone to my property. Calvin contacted local news reporters and independent journalists, promising them an exclusive dramatic story about a billionaire tech chief executive officer abandoning her elderly parents in their greatest time of need. They stood outside the massive iron security gates, surrounded by television cameras and fuzzy microphones trying to weaponize public sympathy. Brenda cried real tears for the cameras, begging her successful daughter to remember where she came from and to open the gates for her struggling, starving family. I sat in my top-floor corner office looking down at the pathetic media circus unfolding on the street level. The thick, soundproof glass of my corporate suite blocked out the noise of the reporters shouting questions through the iron gates. My lead security director stood beside my mahogany desk, holding a digital tablet displaying the live high-definition feeds from the perimeter cameras. He asked if I wanted the tactical team to disperse the crowd or call the local police to enforce the property line. I shook my head, taking a slow, deliberate sip of my morning coffee. I was not going to hide from the local news cameras, and I was certainly not going to let my parents control the public narrative. I pressed the intercom button on my desk and summoned my chief public relations officer into the executive suite. She arrived within seconds carrying a sleek laptop and waiting for my direct orders. I instructed her to draft a formal, legally binding press statement on behalf of Apex Elite Holdings and to release it immediately to every major news outlet standing outside my gates. I did not want a defensive emotional response. I wanted a surgical corporate execution that permanently severed my professional and personal ties to the toxic people standing on the sidewalk. I dictated the exact words, watching her type furiously as we prepared to drop the final heavy hammer on their fake victim routine. The corporate statement was distributed directly to the reporters' smartphones within 10 minutes. The journalists outside looked down at their glowing screens, reading the brutal, unvarnished truth I just authorized for mass public consumption. The press release explicitly detailed how Apex Elite Holdings possessed zero financial or legal ties to the indicted fraudster Connor. It clearly outlined how my company's security infrastructure was actually responsible for detecting and blocking the fraudulent wire transfers that my own family attempted to execute. The statement publicly praised the Federal Bureau of Investigation for their swift action in arresting the criminals who ruthlessly targeted vulnerable minority communities in Atlanta. But the final paragraph of the press release was the absolute killing blow to my parents' public pity play. The corporate statement explicitly named Calvin and Brenda, exposing their willing complicity in the fraudulent second mortgage. It detailed how they actively attempted to protect a white-collar criminal at the direct expense of their own flesh and blood. The press release formally announced that the chief executive officer of Apex Elite had officially secured full permanent custody of the abandoned twin children to protect them from a dangerous and deeply toxic family environment. The statement concluded by declaring that any further attempts by these individuals to contact me or access my corporate properties would be treated as hostile harassment and prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. I watched the security monitors as the journalists finished reading the explosive corporate statement. The reporters immediately turned their heavy cameras away from the corporate gates and pointed their sharp lenses directly at my parents. The sympathetic questions about family loyalty instantly vanished, replaced by harsh, aggressive inquiries about their direct involvement in a federal Ponzi scheme. The reporters asked Calvin why he forged legal documents to help steal retirement money from his own church congregation. They shoved microphones into Brenda's face, asking how she could possibly justify leaving two 6-year-old children abandoned in a commercial airport terminal. The fake victim narrative they tried to sell to the media completely collapsed in real time. Calvin and Brenda realized they had just been publicly destroyed by the very news outlets they tried to weaponize against me. They raised their shaking hands to block the flashing camera lenses stumbling backward away from the aggressive reporters. They had absolutely no money, no home, and now they had no public sympathy left to exploit. They turned around and walked away from my iron gates, disappearing into the crowded city streets as the journalists continued to hound them for answers. I closed the security feed on my monitor and turned my chair back toward my desk. The toxic chapter of my biological family was officially permanently closed. The ticketing agent at the Atlanta International Airport handed back my passport with a look of genuine pity. "I am sorry, Mom, but your first-class ticket to St. Bart's was deliberately canceled late last night by the primary account holder." Before I could process the humiliation, my phone vibrated with a message from my older sister, Jasmine. "You should be taking care of the kids this week anyway. Do not try to follow us." Attached was a photo of my 6-year-old niece and nephew sitting next to a pile of heavy luggage, completely abandoned in the massive departure terminal. My sister and her wealthy white husband were already in the air drinking champagne on their way to a luxury Caribbean resort, leaving me to clean up their mess. They thought I was just the quiet, awkward sister with a silly internet hobby. They had absolutely no idea that the exclusive resort they were traveling to was secretly owned by my cybersecurity and property management firm. The fluorescent lights of the international terminal hummed loudly as I turned away from the counter. My name is Gabrielle, and at 29 years old, I had spent my entire life shrinking myself to fit into my family, narrow expectations. I had packed carefully for this trip, selecting understated outfits that would not draw any attention away from Jasmine and her husband Connor. Connor was a corporate wealth manager who my parents treated like absolute royalty. Every holiday dinner and family event revolved entirely around his high society connections and his perceived elite status. When he entered a room, my parents hung on his every word, completely ignoring my presence, unless they needed someone to clear the dinner plates or fetch more drinks. I rushed past the crowded security lines, desperately scanning the busy seating areas for any sign of the children. A sharp, terrified cry cut through the noise of the rushing travelers. I sprinted toward a cold metal bench near the food court and found them, Jamal and Amara. My 6-year-old twin nephew and niece were huddled together crying softly. Their tiny hands were gripping the handles of 3 massive suitcases. They looked absolutely terrified watching strangers rush past them in the massive airport. I dropped my own bag and pulled them both into a tight, comforting embrace, smoothing their hair and promising them everything was going to be all right. "Where is your mother?" I asked, keeping my voice as calm as possible to avoid scaring them further. Jamal wiped his running nose with the sleeve of his jacket. "Mommy and Daddy said we had to wait right here for you because kids are too loud for Daddy and his business friends." Rage, hot and sudden, flared deep in my chest. I pulled out my phone and dialed my mother, Brenda. She and my father, Calvin, had flown out on the exact same flight with Jasmine and Connor. The line rang several times before my mother finally answered, her voice layered with the ambient noise of a luxury aircraft cabin. "Mom, what is going on?" I demanded. "I am at the airport and my ticket is canceled." Jasmine left the twins sitting by the security gate entirely alone. I heard a heavy, annoyed sigh on the other end of the line. "Stop overreacting, Gabrielle." My mother snapped, her tone immediately dripping with the same toxic condescension I had endured my entire life. Jasmine and Connor work exhausting corporate jobs. They deal with high-level executives all day, and they deserve a stress-free vacation without children crying in their ears. You just stare at screens all day, running that little internet hobby of yours. You have no real grown-up responsibilities. Take the kids back to your apartment and watch them for the week. I gripped the phone so tightly, my knuckles turned white. "Mom, they abandoned 2 small children in a public airport. And you let them cancel my ticket." My mother lowered her voice clearly, trying not to disturb the wealthy passengers sitting around her. "Connor is meeting very important business partners at the resort this week. He is securing our family future. You know how awkward you get around successful people, Gabrielle. Your social anxiety and your plain clothes would just ruin his image. Do not make this about you for once. Be a good aunt. Take the kids home and order some pizza. Have a nice, quiet week." She hung up the phone before I could say another word. I stood there listening to the dead dial tone echoing in my ear. For 29 years, I had let them treat me like the invisible scapegoat. I had let them worship Connor simply because he wore expensive suits and came from a world they desperately wanted to belong to. They thought my cybersecurity and property management firm was just a small freelance gig because I never bragged about my income. I never wore flashy designer brands or demanded the center of attention. They assumed my quiet nature meant I was weak and unsuccessful. They never bothered to ask how I paid for my luxury apartment or why I was always traveling for high-stakes client meetings. They simply wrote me off as the weird tech girl who would never measure up to Jasmine. I looked down at Jamal and Amara, who were staring up at me with wide, tearful eyes. "Are we going home, Auntie Gabby?" Amara asked, her voice trembling with uncertainty. I took a deep breath. Letting the years of hurt and submission completely wash away, I was done, shrinking myself to make my family comfortable. I was done letting them prioritize a fake image over their own blood. I knelt down so I was eye level with the twins, wiping a stray tear from Amara's cheek. "No, sweetie," I said, offering them a warm, genuine smile. "We are not going home. We are going on a vacation." I grabbed the handles of their heavy suitcases and guided the twins away from the commercial ticketing counters. We completely bypassed the long security lines and the crowded terminals, walking all the way down to the private aviation sector of the airport. The atmosphere here was completely different. Quiet, hushed, and dripping with absolute exclusivity. The floors were polished marble, and the air smelled like expensive cedar instead of stale coffee and jet fuel. I walked straight up to the private concierge desk. The attendant looked up, ready to ask if I was lost or looking for the commercial gates. Instead of speaking, I reached into my leather wallet and pulled out a solid obsidian black corporate card, sliding it smoothly across the polished marble counter. The attendant saw the name engraved on the heavy metal Apex Elite Holdings, and her posture instantly straightened into strict professionalism. "Good morning, Madam Chief Executive Officer," she said, her voice filled with absolute respect and obedience. "How can we assist you today?" I looked down at my niece and nephew, who were suddenly smiling, and then looked back at the concierge. "Get my jet ready," I instructed, my voice colder and more powerful than it had ever sounded in my entire life. "We are going to St. Bart's." I picked up my phone and sent a final message to my security team, approving the flight plan, before turning my attention entirely to the children. The iron gates of my private estate closed silently behind the armored SUV, securing us inside a sanctuary of peace. The transition from the chaotic trauma of the Caribbean to a stable, loving environment in Atlanta was not an easy process for the twins. Jamal and Amara had spent the first 6 years of their lives treated as nothing more than decorative accessories for their mother, fake social media empire. Now they were dealing with the devastating emotional fallout of being completely abandoned. The first few weeks in my home were filled with terrifying night terrors and severe separation anxiety. Amara would wake up screaming in the middle of the night, terrified that I had left her sitting alone in a cold airport terminal. Jamal stopped speaking almost entirely, hoarding snacks in his pockets, because he believed the food would suddenly run out. I shifted my entire work schedule around their needs, converting my home office into a colorful playroom where I could conduct business meetings. While sitting on the floor building blocks with my nephew, I immediately hired one of the top child psychologists in the country to conduct intensive therapy sessions 3 times a week, right inside the safety of my home. The therapist helped them process the severe emotional abuse they suffered under Jasmine toxic parenting. Slowly, the dark circles under their little eyes began to fade. Jamal started using his voice again, asking questions about the cybersecurity software. I ran on my computer while Amara discovered a passionate love for painting messy, bright pictures in this backyard. I replaced the rigid designer clothes their mother forced them to wear with comfortable, soft cotton shirts, allowing them to actually run and play like normal, happy children. I showed up for every single dinner, making sure we ate together as a family, and I personally tucked them into bed every night reading stories until they fell into a secure sleep. Once they were emotionally stabilized, I enrolled them in one of the most elite private elementary schools in Atlanta. The campus was absolutely beautiful, but more importantly, it was fortified with an advanced security infrastructure that I personally vetted. I had already secured a strict judicial restraining order against my sister, legally barring her from coming within 500 feet of the children or any property I owned. The school administration had Jasmine photograph posted at every single entrance checkpoint, with strict instructions to immediately contact law enforcement if she ever stepped foot on the grounds. We fell into a beautiful, steady routine, and for a few peaceful months, the toxic shadow of my biological family was permanently erased. But Jasmine was too desperate and too entitled to simply walk away and accept the devastating consequences of her own miserable actions. She was currently facing federal accessory charges and living in a cheap rundown motel, completely cut off from the luxury she craved. Her criminal defense attorney had likely warned her that losing her children would severely damage her chances of securing a sympathetic plea deal with the federal prosecutors. She needed Jamal and Amara not because she actually loved or missed them, but because they were the ultimate prop she could use to play the victim in a court of law. She believed she could bypass the legal system and force her way back through sheer aggressive manipulation. It was a bright, sunny Tuesday afternoon, and I was sitting in my corporate office reviewing a property acquisition report when the emergency red phone on my desk began to flash. I picked up the receiver and heard the calm, professional voice of my lead personal security director. He informed me that Jasmine had just attempted to breach the front gates of the twins' private school. She had arrived in a cheap, rusted taxi, wearing dirty clothes and oversized sunglasses, demanding the administration release her children immediately. When the school receptionist refused and triggered the silent alarm, Jasmine completely lost her mind. She tried to physically push her way through the reinforced glass security doors, screaming hysterically about her biological rights. She did not even make it past the reception desk. The private tactical guards I had permanently stationed at the school moved in with flawless precision, intercepting her hostile advance before the twins ever knew she was on the premises. My security team detained her immediately, pinning her arms behind her back, while the administration contacted the local police department. I stood up from my mahogany desk, feeling a massive surge of protective adrenaline coursing through my veins. I instructed my security director to ensure the children were safely escorted out through a secure rear exit so they would not have to witness their mother's pathetic public breakdown. By the time I arrived at the campus, the authorities had already shoved Jasmine into the back of a police cruiser, officially arresting her for violating a federal restraining order. The final inevitable confrontation took place 2 weeks later inside the cold, sterile walls of the family court building. Jasmine was escorted into the courtroom wearing a bright orange jail jumpsuit, her hands secured tightly in heavy steel cuffs. She looked absolutely miserable, her fake high society arrogance completely broken by the harsh reality of her prolonged incarceration. She sat next to her overworked public defender, trembling violently as the federal judge reviewed the massive stack of incontrovertible evidence I had provided to the court. The judge watched the high-definition security footage of Jasmine abandoning her crying children at the commercial airport terminal. The judge then reviewed the sworn testimony from the school administrators, detailing her aggressive, terrifying attempt to breach the campus security doors while actively violating a protective order. The courtroom was completely silent as the judge looked down from the bench, staring at my sister with absolute, unadulterated disgust. The judge stated clearly that Jasmine had demonstrated gross parental negligence, severe emotional abuse, and a complete lack of basic human decency. The gavel struck the wooden block with a loud, devastating crack, sealing my sister's terrible fate. The judge officially stripped Jasmine of all parental rights, permanently revoking any legal claim she had over Jamal and Amara. Full permanent custody was legally granted directly to me, ensuring my sister could never manipulate or harm them ever again. Jasmine let out a piercing, horrified wail, dropping her head onto the defense table and sobbing uncontrollably as she realized her children were gone forever. The bailiff stepped forward, grabbing her by the arms and forcefully dragging her out of the courtroom to face her pending federal fraud charges. I sat calmly at the petitioner's table watching her disappear through the heavy wooden doors, knowing my niece and nephew were finally completely safe. The story of Gabrielle and her family offers a powerful lesson on the critical importance of self-validation over external approval. For years, Gabrielle was marginalized because she did not fit the superficial narrative her family cultivated. They worshipped a facade of wealth and status represented by Connor, while remaining completely blind to the genuine substance, competence, and integrity standing right in front of them. This dynamic is a painful yet common human reality. We often exhaust ourselves seeking approval from those who are incapable of recognizing our value because they are too focused on maintaining their own narrow, ego-driven perceptions of success. The core lesson here is that you cannot force people to acknowledge your worth, nor should you waste your energy trying to change their narrative of you. Gabrielle's journey to success was built in private, but it became her ultimate liberation. By refusing to shrink herself to make her family comfortable, she wasn't just building a successful company, she was building a life that was immune to their judgment. Her victory didn't come from proving them wrong, but from the quiet, undeniable strength of being right about who she was. Moreover, the narrative serves as a stark warning about the corrosive nature of seeking shortcuts to social status. Her family's obsession with a man who represented the image of success they coveted clouded their judgment to the point of self-destruction. They prioritized social prestige over truth. The result was not just financial ruin, but the complete collapse of their family structure. They were willing to sacrifice Gabrielle their own flesh and blood for a hollow illusion. In life, we often encounter environments that demand we diminish our own light to accommodate the egos of others. The lesson is to prioritize your own foundation. Build your own table rather than waiting for a seat at one where you aren't respected. Integrity, competence, and firm boundaries are the only true forms of long-term security. When you stop performing for an audience that doesn't care for you, you reclaim the power to direct your own destiny. True power is not about controlling others. It is about having the courage to protect your integrity even when the world or your family pressures you to compromise it. Don't wait for permission to be successful or respected. Stop seeking validation from those who cannot see your worth and start building your own empire. Invest in your growth, set your boundaries, and own your narrative today.